Away from that, I explained why I didn't hang out with him, right? Because it's a little fluffy stuff going on.
It's not your scene.
It's not my style.
Not your scene.
About P. Diddy, Puff Daddy, P. Diddy.
Yeah.
Did he do it, right?
Yeah.
I know
He did it.
you've been heavy on social media talking about it.
He did it.
Over the past few months, one name has continued to dominate headlines for reasons that go far beyond music.
Yeah, and it's different than when it was 2016. You know, the game has been elevated. As we can tell, there's no expense being spared. We had a Black Billionaires lunch. You understand?
Right.
And we here together, and we're gonna keep staying together. We getting tighter.
Business or celebrity drama. As Diddy's legal situation evolves, public attention has gradually shifted toward a broader question that analysts, commentators, and industry observers are now openly discussing: how interconnected power really is at the highest levels of entertainment. This isn't about accusations or conclusions. It's about proximity, influence, and the way major figures often move within the same elite circles, something that rarely becomes a public conversation until pressure forces it into the open. Before we go any further, let me ask you this. Do you believe most celebrities truly operate independently? Or do you think success at the top often depends on staying close to the right people for the right reasons? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want every major development broken down clearly as this story continues to unfold, subscribe to The Hidden Evidence, because this situation is changing faster than most people realize. What makes this moment different from countless controversies that came before? It is not a single claim or a viral clip, but the atmosphere surrounding it. Legal analysts have explained that when one powerful figure faces sustained scrutiny, attention naturally expands outward. People begin examining relationships, partnerships, public appearances, and long-standing alliances not to assign blame, but to understand how influence operates behind the scenes. In industries built on networking and access, those connections matter more than most fans ever see. This is where 50 Cent enters the conversation in a way that feels unusually significant. For years, he's positioned himself as an outsider to certain industry spaces, often speaking openly about the choices he made to avoid specific environments. Recently, his commentary has taken on a sharper tone, not revealing evidence, not making formal claims, but repeatedly emphasizing distance. Distance from events, distance from invitations, distance from circles that, in his view, came with expectations he wasn't willing to accept. That framing alone has had an impact. When someone with 50 Cent's history and visibility highlights what they didn't participate in, audiences start asking why. Not because they're being told something illegal happened, but because absence itself becomes part of the story. Why was distance important? Why stress it now? And why are so many conversations suddenly revisiting who was present, who stayed close, and who quietly stepped back over time? As Diddy's situation continues to move through legal channels, those questions have only grown louder. The public isn't just watching court developments, they're watching reactions. Who speaks? Who doesn't? Who clarifies? Who avoids the topic entirely? In an era where silence is rarely neutral, every response carries weight. This is especially true when it comes to the highest profile names in entertainment. Figures like Jay-Z and Beyoncé don't just represent celebrity, they represent structure, carefully built brands, strategic partnerships, and a reputation for control in an industry where chaos is common. That's why their names generate immediate attention whenever conversations turn toward elite networks. Not because wrongdoing is assumed, but because they symbolize how deeply intertwined success, business, and influence can be at the top. Observers have pointed out that when iconic figures operate within the same social and professional environments for years, public curiosity is inevitable, especially during moments of heightened scrutiny. Photos resurface, old collaborations are re-examined, past public appearances take on new meaning, even when no new facts have emerged. It's not a legal process, it's a cultural one. And culture moves fast. What amplifies this effect is the growing role of legal developments as narrative accelerators. The mention of potential testimony, filings, or expanded investigations doesn't need to include dramatic details to shift perception. It simply signals progression. It tells audiences that this story isn't static and that the consequences, whatever they may be, haven't fully revealed themselves yet. That sense of momentum is powerful. Industry insiders have explained that moments like this often trigger quiet recalculations. Public figures review old associations, teams reassess messaging, advisors recommend caution. None of this means guilt, it means awareness. In a business where image and trust are currency, even the appearance of instability can ripple outward. This is why the phrase "everyone tied to Diddy" has become such a compelling and controversial framing online. It's broad, it's vague, and it captures something real about how audiences process influence through networks, not individuals. The risk of that framing is misunderstanding. The power of it is engagement. And engagement is exactly what's driving this story forward. As commentators continue to discuss 50 Cent's upcoming projects and his willingness to revisit uncomfortable topics, anticipation builds not because people expect revelations, but because they expect perspective, a different angle, a voice that isn't aligned with damage control or silence. Whether viewers agree with him or not, they recognize that he's challenging an unspoken rule of the industry. Don't name the system, because once the system becomes the focus, the conversation changes. It stops being about one person's legal trouble and starts becoming about how many careers, brands, and legacies were shaped inside the same environments. It becomes about how success is protected, how access is granted, and how distance suddenly becomes valuable when scrutiny arrives. And that leads to the question that's keeping audiences watching closely. If nothing improper ever happened, why does this moment feel so tense? Why are so many narratives being revisited now? Why are old relationships being reframed? And why does it seem like the pressure isn't easing but spreading? This story isn't being driven by proof. It's being driven by reaction. And reactions often reveal more about power than facts alone ever could. As the conversation around Diddy continued to intensify, a noticeable shift began taking place behind the scenes, one that most casual viewers wouldn't catch unless they were paying very close attention. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent. One by one, people who once appeared comfortable in the same spaces began subtly repositioning themselves, choosing distance over familiarity and silence over explanation. Industry analysts have pointed out that this kind of behavioral shift often signals more than public relations caution. In environments where reputation is currency, even perceived instability can trigger a defensive response. When legal situations evolve, especially those involving high-profile figures, proximity itself becomes a risk factor. Not because guilt is assumed, but because narratives rarely wait for clarity. This is what many observers now describe as the distancing wave. It starts quietly, a lack of public support where it once existed. Fewer public appearances together, no throwback photos, no casual mentions. Over time, that absence becomes noticeable, and the public begins to ask why. The question isn't what happened, but what changed. And once that question takes hold, it spreads. Commentators have noted that Diddy's situation has become a reference point, an example of how quickly influence can shift from asset to liability. People who once benefited from association now find themselves recalculating what that association costs, not legally, but reputationally. Because in today's media environment, perception often outruns fact. This is where the list effect accelerates. As online discussions expand, names resurface not because of new evidence, but because of old proximity. Public appearances from years ago are recontextualized. Business partnerships are re-examined. Social interactions that once seemed harmless suddenly feel loaded. None of this proves wrongdoing, but it does fuel curiosity, which is often enough to keep a story alive. Observers have emphasized that this phenomenon isn't unique to Diddy's situation. It happens whenever a central figure faces sustained scrutiny. The difference here is scale. Diddy's influence spanned music, fashion, media, and social culture for decades. That means the circle around him was unusually large, and that size alone increases the number of people who can be pulled into the conversation, even unintentionally. This is also where 50 Cent's commentary continues to resonate. Rather than focusing on specific claims, he's repeatedly highlighted patterns: who chose to be present, who chose to step away, and who he believes understood the environments they were entering. By emphasizing choice instead of accusation, he shifts the discussion toward responsibility without directly assigning blame. That framing is subtle but powerful. It encourages viewers to think critically instead of emotionally, and critical thinking keeps audiences engaged longer than outrage ever could. At the same time, legal experts have cautioned against confusing cultural discussion with legal reality. Being mentioned, discussed, or speculated about does not equate to wrongdoing. The law operates on evidence, standards, and due process, while public opinion operates on timing, emotion, and visibility. The gap between those two systems is where reputational damage often occurs. That gap is widening here. As filings, delays, and procedural developments continue, the absence of immediate resolution creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled with commentary, theory, and interpretation. Each new voice adds another layer, another angle, another reason for audiences to keep watching. What's particularly striking is how many responses have focused not on defending anyone, but on clarifying distance. Public figures who do address the situation tend to emphasize what they were not involved in, where they were not present, and what they did not participate in. That kind of language is revealing. It suggests an understanding that association alone can shape perception, regardless of facts. Former publicists have explained that this strategy isn't about denial, it's about boundary setting. Drawing a clear line early can prevent speculation from hardening into assumption, but it also signals that the person speaking believes the situation has the potential to escalate further. And that belief matters. Because when enough people act as though something could grow larger, audiences assume it will. This is why the conversation has expanded beyond individuals and into systems. Viewers aren't just asking who was involved, they're asking how these environments function, how access was granted, and why certain behaviors were normalized for so long. These questions don't require answers to remain compelling. Their existence alone sustains interest. It's also why stories like this resist clean endings. Without definitive conclusions, each update feels provisional. Each statement feels strategic. Each silence feels intentional. And in that uncertainty, attention doesn't fade, it consolidates. People stop checking casually and start following closely, waiting for the moment when ambiguity finally breaks. Whether that moment arrives through court proceedings, testimony, or time remains unknown. But what's already clear is that the industry response has changed. The casual confidence of earlier years has given way to caution. The comfort of association has been replaced by the safety of distance, and once that shift happens, it rarely reverses quickly. As observers continue tracking who steps forward and who stays quiet, the story moves further away from speculation and closer to structural examination. Not who did what, but how power protects itself, how narratives are managed, and how reputations are preserved when certainty is impossible. Because in the end, the most revealing part of this story may not be any single allegation or legal outcome. It may be how quickly an entire ecosystem adapts when pressure appears, and how that adaptation exposes dynamics that were always there, just hidden in plain sight. And with every passing week, that pressure doesn't seem to be easing. It's shifting, spreading, and reshaping the conversation in ways that suggest this chapter is far from over. As the distancing wave continued to spread, another pattern quietly took shape, one that revealed how deeply reputation management is embedded into the entertainment industry's survival instincts. This phase wasn't about reacting to headlines anymore. It was about anticipating what might come next and positioning accordingly before narratives hardened into something uncontrollable. Industry watchers began noticing a shift in tone across interviews, public appearances, and even casual commentary. Where confidence once dominated, caution took its place. Where humor once deflected rumors, neutrality replaced it. This wasn't coincidence. It was calculation. When legal situations remain unresolved for long periods, uncertainty becomes the most dangerous element of all. Former legal analysts and crisis advisors have explained that prolonged ambiguity creates a unique kind of pressure. Not the explosive pressure of scandal, but the slow, grinding pressure of waiting for filings, waiting for testimony, waiting for clarity that never seems to arrive. In that environment, people don't wait to be implicated, They preemptively protect themselves. This is where reputational strategy overtakes emotional response. Instead of dramatic denials, we see careful phrasing. Instead of bold defenses, we see limited engagement. And instead of public alignment, we see subtle separation. None of these moves indicate guilt or innocence. They indicate awareness. Awareness that perception often becomes reality long before any legal conclusion is reached. Observers have pointed out that this stage of a controversy is where narratives quietly solidify. The public starts forming assumptions based not on evidence, but on behavior. Who distances themselves first? Who stays neutral? Who refuses to comment? These patterns become stories of their own, and stories once formed are difficult to dismantle. This is also where the role of cultural memory becomes powerful. Audiences don't just consume new information, they reinterpret old information. Past interviews, old photos, and previous collaborations resurface, not because they prove anything, but because they provide context. Context gives speculation something to hold on to. This process doesn't require malicious intent. It's human nature. When viewers see repeated connections between powerful figures over many years, they naturally wonder how much those figures understood about the environments they shared. Again, this isn't about wrongdoing. It's about expectation, about what comes with access, about what people assume is known when someone reaches a certain level of influence. And that's where the story deepens. Because as the focus moves away from individuals and towards systems, the conversation becomes harder to shut down. Systems don't deny accusations. Systems don't issue statements. Systems reveal themselves through patterns of behavior, protection, and silence. This is why commentary around 50 Cent continues to cut through the noise. His emphasis has never been on specific events. It's been on culture, on choices, on the environments people willingly enter in pursuit of opportunity. By framing the conversation this way, he removes the need for proof and replaces it with perspective. He invites the audience to examine incentives rather than incidents. That approach resonates because it feels familiar. Many viewers recognize the dynamic in their own lives, situations where staying close to power meant tolerating discomfort, or where success required overlooking things that didn't feel right. When those parallels form, engagement deepens. The story stops feeling distant and starts feeling personal. At the same time, legal developments, however procedural, continue to act as accelerants. Each mention of expanded timelines, potential testimony, or investigative scope reinforces the sense that this situation is still unfolding. That perception alone sustains attention. Viewers don't need dramatic updates. They just need confirmation that the chapter isn't closed. What complicates matters further is the industry's historical relationship with controversy. Hollywood has seen countless moments where allegations faded without consequence, and others where they reshaped careers permanently. Because there's no consistent outcome, audiences stay alert. They watch for signals. They analyze reactions. They try to predict which path this story might follow. That uncertainty fuels retention. It's also why the conversation has shifted toward legacy. People aren't just asking what happens next. They're asking what this means for how certain eras will be remembered, which partnerships will age well, which associations will be quietly edited out of public narratives, and which figures will emerge untouched simply because they managed distance at the right time. Legacy questions don't require answers to remain compelling. They invite speculation, debate, and reflection, all of which keep viewers engaged far longer than shock ever could. Meanwhile, the silence from some corners has become its own form of communication. When prominent voices choose not to comment at all, audiences interpret that silence through the lens of everything else happening. Silence becomes ambiguous. Ambiguity becomes suspicious. And suspicion, even without foundation, sustains interest. This doesn't mean silence is wrong. It means silence is powerful. Publicists have long understood that sometimes the safest move is to say nothing and let the cycle pass. But in a hyper-connected media environment, silence no longer guarantees disappearance. It often does the opposite. It invites interpretation. That's why this phase of the story feels heavier than the first. It's less about revelation and more about implication. Less about what's said and more about what isn't. And those gaps are where audiences linger, trying to read meaning into every pause. As more time passes without resolution, viewers begin to accept that clarity may not arrive all at once. Instead, it may come through accumulation, small details, subtle shifts, gradual disclosures. This expectation keeps attention locked in, because every update feels like it could be the one that changes everything. And yet, despite all the speculation, one fact remains unchanged. No definitive conclusions have been reached. No final judgments made. No outcomes sealed. What has changed is the atmosphere. The industry feels more guarded. The commentary feels more careful. The stakes feel higher. And the awareness that perception can outpace reality has become impossible to ignore. This is no longer just a story about one individual or one situation. It's a reflection of how power responds to pressure, how narratives evolve without confirmation, and how quickly the ground can shift beneath even the most established names. And as long as that tension remains unresolved, the story continues quietly tightening, drawing attention not through spectacle, but through the steady pull of uncertainty that refuses to let go. As this story reaches its final phase, what becomes most striking is not a single revelation, but the shape of everything that's happened around it. By now, it's clear that this situation was never going to end with a dramatic reveal or a clean resolution. Instead, it has unfolded the way most real power struggles do, slowly, quietly, and through shifts that only become obvious once they've already taken hold. The conversation has moved far beyond one individual. It has become a mirror held up to an entire industry, reflecting how influence circulates, how loyalty is tested, and how quickly people adapt when stability feels threatened. What started as legal scrutiny turned into cultural pressure, and that pressure reshaped behavior across the board. One of the clearest signs of that shift is how carefully language is now being used. Statements are shorter, explanations are narrower, associations are described with precision rather than warmth. This isn't coincidence. It's the result of an industry that understands how easily narratives harden once they escape private control. When clarity is unavailable, control becomes the priority. And that's where this story quietly says the most. Because the absence of definitive answers hasn't reduced interest, it's intensified it. Viewers aren't waiting for shock anymore. They're waiting for confirmation, for alignment between what's being said publicly and what's clearly happening privately. That gap is what keeps attention locked in. What also stands out is how differently people respond under the same pressure. Some speak early, setting boundaries and clarifying distance. Others remain silent, trusting time to dull curiosity. Neither approach guarantees safety. They simply reflect different calculations about risk. In an environment where perception moves faster than fact, every decision carries weight. This is why the role of figures like 50 Cent continues to resonate, not because he has positioned himself as an authority on truth, but because he has challenged an unspoken norm, the idea that silence is always safer than commentary. By repeatedly drawing attention to culture, patterns, and choice rather than specifics, he's kept the focus on systems instead of isolated moments. And once systems become the subject, the conversation becomes harder to dismiss. At the same time, the legal process continues its slow, methodical path. Courts don't move at the speed of public attention, and they never have. That mismatch creates frustration, speculation, and impatience, but it also ensures that this story won't disappear overnight. As long as proceedings remain active and outcomes uncertain, every related development feels relevant. What's important to remember is that none of this exists in isolation. Entertainment, business, and influence are tightly intertwined. Relationships form for many reasons: creative, strategic, financial. When one part of that web is stressed, the tension spreads. That doesn't automatically mean wrongdoing. It means vulnerability. And vulnerability is something the public rarely gets to see at the top. Perhaps the most lasting impact of this moment won't be a verdict or a headline, but a shift in how audiences interpret proximity. The idea that being around something powerful comes with responsibility, that access isn't neutral, that distance, once ignored, can suddenly look like foresight. These are uncomfortable realizations, which is why they resonate. As viewers, we're left with questions that don't have easy answers. How much do people really know about the environments they benefit from? Where does accountability begin and end in systems built on silence? And how many stories never fully surface, not because they're untrue, but because they're managed out of view? This chapter may close without a dramatic ending, but the ripple effects will last much longer. Reputations have already shifted. Narratives have already changed. And the way people talk about power, access, and influence has already been altered by what hasn't been resolved. That's the real takeaway. Not a list of names, not a single allegation, but the understanding that when pressure appears, systems reveal themselves, and once revealed, they can't be unseen. If you followed this story from the beginning, let me know what you think. Do you believe moments like this actually change how industries operate? Or do things quietly return to normal once attention fades? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to stay ahead of every verified update, every shift in narrative, and every story that matters beneath the headlines, make sure you're subscribed to The Hidden Evidence, because these stories don't just end, they evolve.